have the 5 books of Moses. It's also called the Pentateuch because penta means 5. Like the Pentagon is a building with 5 sides to it. If you ever look at an aerial photo of the Pentagon. The first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Torah, we refer to it as the Torah. So when we talk about the Torah, we're talking specifically about Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim, namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the story from the creation of the universe through Noach and his flood, and then our patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives, our matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And then, of course, we end up coming into Egypt. The brothers sell their brother Yosef, Joseph, into slavery, and he rises to be viceroy of Egypt. And eventually there's a famine that brings the rest of the extended family to Egypt. And that brings you into the second book of the Torah, which describes the Jews being in Egypt, the slavery, and the exodus from Egypt, 10 plagues, going to Mount Sinai and getting the Torah. And so it goes. After the 5 books of the Torah, we now enter the land of Israel in the book of Yehoshua, Joshua. And that book describes essentially the years under Joshua who followed Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. After Joshua, you have the book of Shoftim, Judges. And that's a series of accounts from one judge. A judge in those days did not simply sit in a court of law, but also was a prophet and led the nation in lieu of a king. And that's the period of people like Gideon, Shimshon, Samson, Devorah, Deborah, Yiftach, people of that fame. And with the end of the era of the judges, we come into Shmuel, which is what we're studying now, the book of Samuel. There are 2 volumes to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. The first book, we believe, was written by Samuel the prophet, Shmuel. And we also believe he wrote the book of Judges, Shoftim, and the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. And so we were learning from the beginning of Joshua about a year ago, and then I ran into my lung illness that required that we take what's turned into a year's hiatus. And now we're back in business. So we learned the book of Joshua, and we learned the book of Judges, Shoftim, and we learned about all those different judges. And we resumed with Shmuel Aleph, the first Shmuel, book of First Shmuel. And so we've learned chapters 1 through 4, and we continue today with chapter 5. Now, to remind you where we left off last week, it was a moment of deep tragedy. The Jews had just fallen in battle to the Philistines. The Philistines had killed 30,000 Jewish soldiers. The 2 sons of Eli the Kohen, Eli the high Kohen, who's the minister. Sometimes the word Kohen is translated as priest, but we Jews really don't translate Kohen as priest. It's a different phenomenon. We just actually use the English spelling of Kohen with a K to convey the priest-like aspect is that the Kohen offers the sacrifices at the altar. But beyond that, you don't, let's say, confess to a Kohen. A Kohen is not exactly, let's say, like a Catholic priest. Kohen can marry, Kohen must marry, actually, and things like that. So Eli was the high Kohen, essentially the prophet of that generation. He was 98 years old. And where we left off last week, word had just come back to the camp at Shiloh, that the Jews had been defeated in battle by the Philistines, 30,000 killed. The 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, who had gone out with the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron Brit Hashem, the Ark of the Covenant, which held the 2 tablets that Moshe brought down from Mount Sinai, and a glass jar that held manna, as an eternal memorial for future generations to see, and miraculously it never decayed. That Ark of the Covenant, the Aron Brit Hashem, was seized by the Philistines in their victorious battle. Chafni and Pinchas, as the Kohanim who were guarding the Aron Brit Hashem, were killed defending the Ark from being taken. They were killed. The Philistines got the Ark. The word came back to the camp that we have been massacred, defeated terribly in battle. And also your sons, they told Eli, Chafni and Pinchas died in battle. And that did not kill him. And then the reporter added, and the Ark was taken by the Philistines, and that killed him. And when the wife heard that her husband's been killed, that she was pregnant, but when she heard that the Ark was taken, she died in her childbirth, and she gave birth to Chavod, in English Ichabod, meaning glory has been taken away. We've lost the Ark. And that's where we left off last week. The Ark is in the hands of the Philistines. Now, the Ark is, I can't even begin to describe to you what the Ark meant and what it meant at that time. It was the precursor to the Holy Temple. The Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple that would ultimately be built by King Solomon on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, well, that had not happened yet. So before we had a permanent structure, we learned last week about Shiloh, the city of Shiloh, where there was the meantime central structure of God's home, the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, and in the Mishkan was the Ark. And so this Ark was the repository of God's glory. Again, the 2 tablets and the man, and now the Philistines have it. We continue from there. Chapter 5. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Now let's take a look at the map. Give you a sense. Some of you may already know the map of Israel, but let me give you a bit of a sense here. This is the land of Israel, part of it. Obviously, it's the same land today that comprises the state of Israel. This gray area, Philistia, is the Gaza Strip. In fact, here's the city of Gaza. And by the way, as I've mentioned to those of you who might find it a little disturbing at times, irritating to the eye, I have the cursors set in a way that it looks like about 6 or 7 cursors, not just one, to help you see where I'm pointing. And then when I get your attention and help locate it, I stop moving it so it's just a single cursor. Okay. So Gaza is the central city of the Gaza Strip. Today it's known as the Gaza Strip, and tragically it is run today by Hamas, the terrorist organization. Since it borders on Israel, they shoot rockets into Israel, and there have been a few wars between Israel and Hamas. On the other side, over here in the black, is Egypt. So Egypt and Israel are right near each other, separated by the Gaza Strip. In biblical times, it was Philistia. It was the land of the Philistines, and its major cities were Gaza, Ashkelon, which today is part of Israel. It's a little bit north of the Hamas Gaza Strip. Ashdod, which of course is north even of that, but in those days was part of the Philistines. The city of Ekron was northernmost in the land of the Philistines. If you go east, you start, before you know it, you hit places like Bethlehem, and Jerusalem, or a little bit south, Hebron. Give you another picture of the cities, a little bit more focused on those cities. Here we are. Here you see again the Gaza Strip, which they label on this map as Canaan. It borders on the Mediterranean Sea. And you see those cities, Ashdod, and the cities of the Philistines, Ekron got, and it's near Beit Shemesh, which is just east of the Philistine area in Jewish territory. And Beit Shemesh is right near Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. Okay, you'll see why I'm bringing that out in a moment. So here we are. Back to the text. So the Plishtim lakhu et Aron Elokim, the Philistines took the Ark of God, vaychu Plishtim et Aron Elokim vayaviu oto bet Dagon. And the Philistines took that ark and brought it to their religious temple. Their god, they had many gods, but their leading god had the name Dagon, in English D-A-G-O-N, from the Hebrew word dag, or the Middle Eastern word dag, which means fish. The god was depicted in a statue as the upper part of the body was that of like a fish, and the lower part of the body was that of a human being, like the equivalent of a male equivalent of a mermaid. Not making a pun, a merman. There's such a word, merman, not to be confused with Ethel Merman. And so what you had was this fish-like god, obviously was a large scale. And here we go. So the god is Dagon. Let's see if it's in English, Dagon. And the Philistines brought the Ark of Dagon, their gigantic stature, not in front of or in back of, but like left and right. Vayatzigu oto eitzel Dagon. They said, this is very important, not in front, not in back, but beside, alongside. Doesn't matter left or right, it doesn't tell us. But here's why that's important. Everybody goes to sleep. Next, this is in the city of Ashdod. So as I mentioned, nowadays Ashdod is part of southern Israel. Very, very much southern Israel, no question about it. But in those days, it was still part of it was north of Gaza, but part of the Philistine territory. This is where the Temple of Dagon was, in Ashdod. So the Philistines had fought with us, right? We came out of Shiloh, went down to Bethel, the Philistines battled, and took the ark to Ashdod. Okay. And that's where their main temple was. The next morning, Vayashkimu Ashdodim Mocharat, V'hidnei Dagon nafel fanav artza. The next morning, the Ashdod populace that came to temple walked in and they found their gigantic statue of their god Dagon had somehow fallen off its pedestal and lay on the floor, not alongside the Ark of God, but in front of it, in a position as though it were prostrating to God and bowing down to the God of Israel. So that was an impossibility. Hard enough to explain how this gigantic statue that was secured had fallen off its pedestal with no one having been in the temple. But even harder to explain how in falling, it ended up making a complete 180-degree turnaround so that its head was facing the Ark of God. Lifnei Aron Hashem. Nofel fanav artza lifnei Aron Hashem. So they didn't know what to make of it. They rose it back up and got it back up on its pedestal. Vayikhu et Dagon, vayashivu oto limkomo. They put it back in its place. Now comes the next morning. Vayashkimu v'boka mimocharat. And now the next morning, people woke up, went to the temple, and now V'hinei Dagon nofel fanav artza. Once again, Dagon had fallen off its pedestal, although having been set up to the side of the Aron, of the Ark, it somehow was again Lifnei Aron Hashem. Somehow it had fallen and then turned around so that its head area was facing the Aron as though prostrate, but this time, for Rosh Dagon, Ushtei Kapot Yadav Krutot El Hamiftan. The head of the statue was cut off, and its two hands were cut off. Rak Dagon Nishar Alav. Only basically the torso of the statue and its lower half remained. Its hands and head somehow were cut off. And they got the message. Al kain lo yidrachu kohenei Dagon v'chol haba'im bet Dagon al miftan Dagon ba'ashdod ad hayom hazeh. And therefore, through the time that Shmuel was writing the book of Samuel, to that very day, that is why to this day, referring to the time Shmuel was writing the book, it had become in that temple, that was an area that the priests of Dagon never again set foot in that area because they were spooked by it. Verse 6, Vatichbad Yad Hashem el ha'ashdodim vayishimim. Now, after those 2 days of destruction, of really like something going on with that statue, a plague broke out in the city of Ashdod. God, and that word vatichbad is similar to wording that we find in the 10 plagues of Egypt. God basically smote the people of Ashdod with a terrible plague. Our Midrash tells us that the Philistines knew about the 10 plagues that God had done to Egypt. The entire world knew about it at that time. Let's take a look. There's a very interesting line. Let's pull it from here. There's a very interesting line in the Tanakh that I'll bring to your attention. It's going to be the book of Shemot. I think it should be chapter 15 as your shir. Okay, this is right after the splitting of the Red Sea. The sea has come back together again. It has capsized all the Egyptian soldiers. They've all drowned to death. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, begins singing, leads the nation singing a song of praise to God for what just happened. For the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and riders went into the sea, and God turned back on them the waters of the sea. But the Israelites marched on dry ground in the midst of the sea. And as he sings that song, he has these words. He speaks about how everybody heard in the world had heard about what happened. In your love, you led the people, you redeemed. In your strength, you guide them to your holy abode. Shama'u amim yergazun, chil achaz yoshvei plashet. The peoples of the world heard, and they trembled. Agony gripped the dwellers in Philistia, the area we're covering now. They knew about what God had done to Egypt. Not only they, but the clans of Edom, the Edomites, of Nifalu, Alufei Edom, Ele Moav, Yochid, Namogu Koishve Canaan. The Moabites heard about it. The Canaanites heard about it. So it was known throughout the Middle East what had happened this is 400 years earlier. That is, Moshe is singing the song, and we're now 400 years later in the book of Shmuel. These people knew about it. How can I compare it? You know about something from 400 years ago, some famous battle? I mean, let's think about it. It's now the year 2023. Have you ever heard of the American Revolutionary War? If you went to an American public school before 1990, you probably heard of it. And the American Revolutionary War was what, 1770s? So that's more than 300 years ago. It's 300 years ago, 250. Have you heard of a war from the 1600s or the 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition of 1492? If you've heard of any of those, have you ever heard of King Henry VIII? So there are certain events that have happened 400 years ago, thoroughly believable, that people would have heard of it so well and so dramatically that it would be passed down through the generations. So I have no interest per se in the history of Great Britain. I mean, a little bit, it's interesting, but I know about Henry VIII, and he wanted a male heir, and he couldn't get one. And he married one wife, and she gave him a boy that she had 2 or 3 miscarriages. And finally, she gave him a girl that wasn't good enough. So he locked her up and he took the next one. She didn't work out well, so he cut off her head, took the next one. She didn't work out well, so he cut off her head. Like, we know about this. They even made a song. Ironically, it was the British song, I'm Henry VIII, I am, Henry VIII, I am. Ironically, the lyrics to that song, it takes an Orthodox rabbi from New York to tell you that the lyrics were wrong. They got Henry VIII all mixed up. But the idea is that to hear something from 400 years ago, sure, they had heard about it. Pil Achaz Yoshvei Plashet, the people of Plishtim had heard about it. Back to this. So now the Ashdodites, having heard about it, knowing the history, and now God smites them with a plague. Now, the Midrash, our Midrash, tells us that the people of Ashdod and the people of the Philistine area were persuaded. It's not in the text, it's the Midrash. They were persuaded that God used up all his stuff. In other words, God could have taken the Jews out with 1 plague. He didn't need 10 plagues, or he could have done all the plagues at once. So they became convinced that God had a plan. He had 10 plagues in his bag, and he was going to bring one at a time till he used all the plagues. So they were persuaded he's got nothing more up his sleeve. And so they were hit with like a plague that's so horrible that, as I was thinking in preparation for class, how am I going to describe it? And there's no way to describe this plague without you feeling squeamish. He smites, it sounds a little bit funny almost, because when we talk about the private body parts, people laugh and this is serious stuff. He smote the people of Gaza with hemorrhoids. I don't know whether you ever have had basic hemorrhoids, the kind for which you might use preparation H. Hemorrhoids can be very painful. They can take a long time to kind of go away without surgery. And they're no fun. Now, in the modern society, where you have indoor plumbing and indoor bathrooms and toilets that are all kinds of models and styles and comfort levels, and you have Charmin, please don't squeeze the Charmin, you have soft toilet paper. I mean, I don't want to go too deeply into it, but in the modern era, the reality is that hemorrhoids are really awful, but you can get preparation H and you can deal with it. Put yourself instead 2,000, 3,000 years ago. There's no indoor toilets. There's not even necessarily an outhouse at every home. Some people just have to go into the field. And they bring a pan with them, or they don't bring a pan, God knows what they did. And they didn't have Charmin toilet paper, and they didn't even have the toilet paper you find at the institutional buildings where they save money by giving you toilet paper from, and they didn't have preparation H. And they didn't have medicines like we have now. To get hemorrhoids and to get bad hemorrhoids. But that's not the whole plague. The Midrash explains, and it's in the text, he sent mice. He sent a plague of mice. And the mice went into people's large intestines. When people would crouch down to do their business with their hemorrhoids, mice from the field would enter their intestines and gnaw away. And I'm going to leave it at that. Take it from me, it was a plague. It was worse than It was worse than frogs. It was worse than lice. And I mention this because this is going to be dominant in chapter 5. Otam Batachorim. It's very interesting. I want to highlight this for you. Even if you don't read Hebrew, you recognize parentheses. If you do read Hebrew, all the better. You see there's a word here in parentheses. And then there's another word right near it in brackets. The word in parentheses is more literally the word for hemorrhoids. The word in brackets is a more elegant word. The Bible and the Jewish tradition of reading the Bible is that Hebrew is called a holy language, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language. And there are certain words we do not speak in Hebrew, even though we have a word for it. So, for example, when the Torah is read in shul, in synagogue, there are 2 places in the Torah where God warns the nation, if you sin on a certain level, there will be terrible, terrible punishments. It's known as the Tochacha. It's the place where really it's the horrible punishments that we are warned in the end of the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, Parshat Kitavo, and also in Bechukotai in the end of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. And God warns certain terrible things will happen. And there are 2 words among the warnings that are considered to be so shocking in terms of what will happen that we do not pronounce that word publicly. Instead, we pronounce a synonym that is less strong. And that's what's happening here. The word for Hebrew, the Hebrew word for the hemorrhoids, there's a stronger, harsher word, and techorim is considered to be a less harsh word. Wanted to bring that out. Vayishimim vayachotam bat chorim at Ashdod v'Yatvuleh. He smote them with hemorrhoids. And again, I've described to you what we're talking about, and I've described in a little bit of detail so we appreciate we're not just talking about, well, get on Amazon and pick up a box, or go to the drugstore and pick up a box of Preparation H. Vayeru Anshe Ashdod kichen, and Ashdodi people, Ashdodites, as they started realizing, it's not only in our house that everybody's been smitten, but all the neighbors have it. Everybody out here is getting it. Va'amrulo Yeshiva Aron Elokei Yisrael Imanu. They said it must be the Ark of God. We heard what happened in the Temple of Dagon. This Ark is, we got to get this out of the city. Ki koshta yado aleinu v'al Dagon Eloheinu. Because the God of Israel, he's turned severely against us, just as he has against our God Dagon. So we got to get this thing out of here. We thought it would be an amazing spoil of victory. We have the Ark of the God of the Jews. Instead, we got to get rid of it. Vayishlachu vayasvu et kol sarnei plishtim aleihem vayomru na manasel aron elokei Yisrael. So they gathered all their leaders together and sought counsel. What are we going to do with this Ark? Vayomru gat Yisov Aron elokei Yisrael. And the leaders said, send it to the city of Gath. Get it out of here. Send it to the city of Gath. So vayasebut Aron elokei Yisrael. So they sent it from Ashdod to Gath. Let's look at the map. See, they sent it. Well, this one doesn't have. That's why I pulled 2 maps. In case one didn't, the other would. They said this one. They said send it from Ashdod over here, eastward to Gath. Get it away. We, Ashdod, are on the westernmost side of this country of Philistia. Send it to the easternmost section to Gath. Get it out of here. So they sent it to Gath. Vayihi acharei hesabu oto. Vatahi yad Hashem ba'ir muhumad gdola ma'od. So they sent it to Gath, and right after they sent it, there was a massive plague in Gath. Vayach et anshei ha'ir mikaton va'ad gadol. And this plague smote everyone in the city, from young to old. Vaysatru lahem, there you go with that parenthetical bracket word again. And they got smitten out with the hemorrhoids. Vayishalchu et Aron Elokim Ekron. So they decided, we don't want it either. So they sent it from Gath to the city of Ekron. Here's Gath. They sent it up north to Ekron. So it's gone from Ashdod to Gath to Ekron. Everybody's trying to get rid of it. Why don't they just attack it? Why don't they just cut it up? Or, well, they wouldn't dare. They want to just get rid of it. They don't want this God that has done this to their God and that is smiting them. They're not going to attack directly. Vayihikavo Aron Elokim Ekron, and now it's hit the city of Ekron. Vayizaku ha'ekronim lemor, hesabu elayit Aron Elokei Yisrael lamiteni v'yami. The Ekronites start screaming, oh my God, the people of Gath are trying to kill us. They've sent the ark to us for the purpose of killing, because everybody already has heard what's going on. So what are they going to do? Vayishlachu vayasvu et kol sharnei plishtim vayomru, shalchu et Aron Elokei Yisrael v'yashuv lemkomo. So they called a national conference of all leaders of all their cities, Ekron and Gath and Ashdod and all their cities, for the purpose of saying, what are we going to do? And it was decided, we have to send the ark back to the Jews. But you can't just go back to the Jews. We're at war with the Jews. Whoever goes with that ark back to the Jews is liable to get in, God knows what the Jews will do to us. But we have to get rid of it. The idea is that everybody was dying in these cities, so they had to get rid of it. And whoever did not die, because many died of the plague, and those who did not die, huku bat chorim, v'ta'al shavar ha'ir hashamayim, and those who did not die got smitten with these horrific hemorrhoids, to the degree that the city was crying out to the heavens, chapter 6. Vayehi, Aron Hashem b'stei plishtim sheva chadashim. So the ark in all stood in the Philistine territory for 7 months. And that was it. Vayekra'u plishtim lakoanim lakosmim lemor, na'asel manasel Aron Hashem, hodiunu b'amen shalchanon limkomom. And the Philistines consulted with their wizards and their religious priests. They had already decided, we're going to get rid of this ark. We're sending it back to the Jews. What's the best way to send it back to the Jews? Because we don't even know how to send it back without worse things happening. Vayomru, and the wizards and the priests of the Philistines said, Im mishachim et Aron Elokei Yisrael, al teshachu oto rekam. In light of what we've all been through, if you're going to send, and you better send, the Ark of the Covenant back to the Jews, you better send it back with an offering to their God. Don't just treat it like you're dumping it on their ground. He may take that personally as an insult, that you're dumping it. It has to be brought back and given almost like presented as a gift with a significant kind of like a sacrificial offering. Ki hashev teshiva lo asham. You have to give him something like a sacrificial offering. Oz terafu, and then maybe you will be healed. We all will be healed from this horrible plague. V'nodalachem lama lo tasur yado mikam. So what's the offering going to be? Vayomru moha asham asher nashivlo. People said, okay, what kind of offering should we give? Should we give bulls or sheep, or what should we offer their God? And the thought was, in the minds of the Philistines, Vayomer Mispar Sanei Philistine, the Philistine officers recommended Chamisha Techorei Zahav, fabricate 5 hemorrhoids of gold. I don't even know what a hemorrhoid looks like. So I looked it up. I wouldn't teach this class without letting you see what a hemorrhoid is. But the thing is, as I was looking for a picture to show you, a lot of them, let me put it this way, a lot of the pictures that I found are the kind of pictures that belong in parentheses. I had to find a picture that belongs in brackets. If you get my drift. So here's the best I was able to find, an artist's rendition. Where's my hemorrhoid? Where's the hemorrhoid? There we go. How do you get hemorrhoids to go away? And it's not a stand-up comedy question. This is the deal. These are hemorrhoids. They look like little, I don't know what, beans, like kidney beans or yeah, they look like beans or almonds. And remember, this was a plague. People had really big ones. And so the wizards and the priests of the Dagon and of their religion said, you need to create 5 of these in gold. And you also need to create 5 mice in gold. That was the plague. Chamisha techorei zahav, chamisha achbarei zahav. 5 golden hemorrhoids. I tell you, the way it's written, it sounds like that song, that's Christmas song, 6 turtle, I don't know, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, so I don't know, 6 turtle doves, 3, 5 golden hemorrhoids. But they're saying that basically 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice, corresponding to the number of lords of the Philistines. There were 5 main cities of the Philistines. We've already learned about cities like Ekron and Ashdod. And so for each of those cities, a large hemorrhoid, not a small hemorrhoid, but make one oversized, and 5 golden mice, not small mice, but, you could make a big mouse statue also, like in Disneyland. For the same plague struck all of you. For every one of those cities, the Philistines, there was that plague. V'asitem tzalmei techorechem, v'tzalmei achbarechem, hamashchitim et ha'aretz, unetatem lelokei Yisrael kavod. So you should make statues, basically, of these mice and of these hemorrhoids, statues of gold, and give them as a serious offering to honor the God of the Jews. Ulai yakel et yadome alechem. Perhaps he will reduce and he will basically let his hand loosen from all of you and let this plague go away. Umei al Elohechem umei al artzachem, so that the plague will depart from the land and also stop attacking our gods. V'loma techabdu et, a very interesting line. Loma techabdu et levavchem ka'asher kibdu Mitzrayim uparo et libam. Very interesting line. These advisors, the priests and the wizards, add the following. For those of you who are kind of stubborn and you don't want to give in to the Jews, you just had a battle with them, you defeated the Jews in battle, and you just don't want to give in, and you want to tough it out, we recommend don't tough it out, because you all know what happened in Egypt. They had a plague, and instead of giving in, they decided to tough it out, and then came the frogs, and they're going to tough it out, and then came the lice, then came the wild animals and the pestilence, and then came the boils, and then came the hailstones and the locusts and the darkness and the smiting of the first. Let's just get done with this right now. Don't start up with them and don't tough it up. Don't harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts 400 years ago. As you know, when he made a mockery of them, God made a mockery of Egypt, and they had to let the Jews go anyway. So therefore, let's just get this done with. Atah with an ayin means now. Do the following. Make those statues. Get the 10 items together, the 5 statues of golden hemorrhoids and the 5 statues of golden mice. Put them on a big wagon. An agalah is a wagon. Put them on a new wagon that's never been used. Don't insult their God and use a wagon that perhaps on some previous occasion was used to transport something less dignified. Build a special brand new wagon just for this purpose. And now take 2 parot alot, milk cows. In other words, not strong bulls that you would expect to have the strength to pull a wagon, especially a heavily loaded wagon, but rather 2 milking cows, which have they've never had a yoke placed on them. They've never pulled a wagon in their lives, because we want to see whether a certain miracle unfolds. And just the idea that milking cows would be able to pull such a heavily loaded wagon itself would be a miracle, but let's do this. Asartim in a parot bagalah, tie the 2 milking cows to that wagon, vashivotim b'neim me'achareim habayta, and let the others follow them. Let their calves follow them. Ulakachtem et Aron Hashem u'natatem oto el ha'agalah. Place the Ark of the Covenant on that wagon. Biat klei hazahav asher hajivotem lo hasham. Tasumu ba'argaz mitzido. And as far as these 5 golden statues of mice and 5 golden statues of hemorrhoids, place them in a sort of a treasure chest alongside the ark. V'shilachtem oto v'halach. And then with these 2 milking cows leading the wagon, if they're even capable of pulling it, just go away and let them go in whatever direction they go, if they can go. RIETS, verse 9. And then watch. Im derech gevulo ya'aleh beit shemesh, if perchance they actually can pull that wagon, and not only can pull the wagon, but if they end up able to pull the wagon from the land of Gaza and the Philistines to the area of Beit Shemesh in the land of Israel, let's look where Beit Shemesh actually is. If they could pull from this part of Canaan, Kath and Ekron, we've learned about, to Beth Shemesh, which is just before Jerusalem. If they can do that, and they just on their own, no one's leading them. If of all the places in the world, that's where they end up leading the wagon, then what we see, Im derech gevulo ya'aleh beit shemesh, hu asa lanu et hara'ah hagdolah hazot. Then it's the God of Israel who has brought upon us all this terrible stuff, these plagues, these mass deaths, these hemorrhoids in the mice, v'imlo. On the other hand, if the milk cows are unable to pull the wagon, or if they pull the wagon and it ends up anywhere other than the Jewish city of Beth Shemesh, then v'yadanu, kilo yadona gabanu. then we can assume that this is just happenstance, that it wasn't the God of Israel that smote us, but rather mikrahu hayalanu. It just happened by chance. So let's see what happens. Vayasu hanashim kain, vayachushte parot alot, vayasrum ba'agala. So the Philistines did exactly thus, took 2 milking cows, bound them to a wagon, vinyet benehem kalu b'bayit, vayasimun aron Hashem el ha'agala, and they placed the Ark of the Covenant on that wagon, v'et ha'argaz v'et achbez ahav v'et samet chaream, and then they create, and that chest, that treasure chest in which they placed the 5 statues of golden mice and the 5 golden statues of hemorrhoids. Vayisharna haparot baderech al derech beit shemesh b'mesila achat hochu haloch v'ga'o. And then they went and they just went to see what's going to be with the sheep, with the cow. They went on a direct path. That's the way they went. V'lo saru yaminu small. And they did not deviate along the path, left or right. And mind you, nowadays you have freeways and highways, and you get on a freeway or highway, you really can't go that far right or that far left. There are guardrails. But you're talking about open fields. All right, open fields, there are pathways. Those cows are not trained. They can go any direction in the world. They did not deviate left or right. They stayed on a direct beeline to the very city, Beit Shemesh, that the priests and the wizards had said, if the cows go that way, it's a sign that the God of Israel was the one smiting us with this plague, and it wasn't just happenstance. The leaders of the Philistines did not go in the front. They went from the back, and they followed from the back to see what would happen. And they followed, and they saw that the wagon went right up to Beit Shemesh. Now, meanwhile, the Jews in Beit Shemesh are minding their own business. And this is the last part of today's chapter 6. Ubeit Shemesh kotzrim ketzir chitim be'emek. This was a time of the harvest. It was the wheat harvest. Chita is wheat. People were harvesting. And from out of nowhere, by Yeshua Denaim, they look up and, oh my gosh, here's the Ark of the Covenant. And this is going to bring us to something I've got to prepare you for. And it's very important to understand. In Judaism, we take God very, very seriously. God is not a joke. And we have to treat God with awe, A-W-E, with fear. There's a reference to Yiras Shamayim, the Yiras Chet. We fear God. When you go into a synagogue, for example, for prayer, you're supposed to walk in with great reverence and great solemnity. It's interesting. Christians do that in church. They're very solemn. People do it at the theater. You go to an opera, you go to a Broadway play or a equivalent theatrical performance elsewhere. People know to be quiet, respectful. There's unfortunately a certain culture in certain circles of the Orthodox Jewish world, not mainstream and certainly not permitted under Jewish law, but it developed over the centuries among less educated people who would come to synagogue and would talk in synagogue and be irreverent. They'd come in, they'd sit down, part of the reason is the service goes long on Shabbat morning. You don't see that so much during the week, but on Shabbat morning, services run 2.5 hours to 3 hours. I remember being very surprised. I would get a haircut, and since I'm a rabbi, like the haircutting person would ask, sometimes, not always, but they look to make conversation. And they might ask, so what's it like to be a rabbi? What's it What's your service like? And then, like, how long is your service? And I'd mention our service is about 2.5, 3 hours. And it's like, it would be so shocking. And they're holding the scissors. And like, I'd learned from experience to duck after I would tell them 3 hours in shul, because their thought was we go to services to pray. If I had to sit 3 hours, it would kill me. I'd ask them, how long is your service? It's an hour. And I would, if they didn't get me with their scissors that way, I'd go back an hour's service. I can't even believe it. You get in and out in 1 hour. I mean, that's wow. So it might be because the Orthodox Jewish Shabbat service is 3 hours that a lot of people don't have the discipline to just stay quiet for 3 hours and pray and listen, pay attention. But this is a very important concept. When you're in shul, when you're in a synagogue, you're supposed to be quiet. You're supposed to be reverent, just the way they are in church, the way they are in mosque, the way they are on Broadway. An Orthodox synagogue deserves the same reverence. And why am I saying this? Because you're going to see what happens. They get irreverent. What happens is, oh, wow, the Ark of the God, wow. Hey, have you ever looked inside before? You're not allowed to look inside. If you're standing in the appropriate location, in the distance, you could be within like a certain distance. You can't just walk up to the Ark, open it up, and start poking around inside. I'm not saying that that's the same for an Ark in a synagogue and a regular shul, but the Ark of the Covenant of God, Aron Brit Hashem. And what happened was, when the people saw the Ark show up from out of nowhere, these 2 cows just suddenly brought the Ark of the Covenant into town. The people started dancing, and there was a lot of revelry, and they overdid it. And here we go. They saw the Ark and they were thrilled. They were so happy. And the wagon brought the Ark into the field of a person named Joshua. He's not the Joshua who took us across the Jordan River. This is generations later. This is the book of Samuel, Shmuel. His name is Joshua also. Beit Hashimshi, it means he's from Beit Shemesh. And Vatamot Sham, and the wagon stopped there. That's where it stopped. Visham Evan Gedolah, Vayavak Uratse Ha'agala V'yaraparot Elu Olal Hashem. First thing the people did, and this was appropriate, is they felt this wagon is extraordinarily holy. It is the wagon that carried the Ark. We want to offer this wagon to God. So they cut the wood of the wagon that would create the pyre, P-Y-R-E, the pyre on which, and then they took the 2 cows and they offered those cows as an offering, a sacrificial offering to God. And that's appropriate, because those cows had become very holy, and that wood was holy. The Halavim, Horidu Aron Hashem, the Levites, they took the Ark of the Covenant and the argaz and the treasure chest, Sheri Torah Shabo Klei Zahav, that had the golden statues of the mice and of the hemorrhoids. Vayasimu Evan Agdolavi on Shebet Hashemesh Alu Olot Vayasbachu Zvachim Bayomahu Hashem, and the people of Beit Shemesh offered sacrifices, and a lot of things they did were ritually very appropriate, very honorable, and exactly what should be done. However, as this is going on, the 5 officers of the Philistines saw what was going on from a distance. They saw that indeed the wagon was dragged and taken to to Beit Shemesh. They saw confirmation, therefore, that it was the God of Israel who had brought the plagues, and they returned to Ekron. And it refers in verse 17 that the 5 statues in gold were brought, and it lists the 5 cities, why they chose the number 5. Ashdod, Gaza, or Gaza, Ashkelon, Gat, and Ekron. Okay. And likewise, the statues of the mice marked for all the cities of the Philistines, their main cities, 5, 5. That's why it was done that way. But then what happened is that the people became overly giddy and overly silly. And they went from a more solemn celebration to more revelry. And God smote those Jews who looked inside the ark. And God smote a very fierce plague on those people. And when people in Beit Shemesh saw that a plague now smote them, of course, for different reasons. With the Philistines, of course, they had the temerity to take the ark of the God of Israel and think they could hold it in the temple of Dagon. But for the Jews, it was because they actually had the temerity to open the ark and stick their heads in and to start looking around like it's something like an exhibit in a museum. So they said, oh my God, who can stand before the God of Israel, the holy God? The Elmi Ya'aleh Me'aleinu. Now, what are we supposed to do? Vayishlchu malachim el yoshvei kiryat arim limor, heishivu blishtim et Aron Hashem, redu ha'alu oto alechem. So the farmers of Beit Shemesh, who were in the middle of their wheat harvest, felt they're just not spiritually mature enough and pious enough to bear the responsibility of housing the Ark of God. So they turned to the city of Kiryat Ye'arim, and they asked those people who run that city, would you kindly take custody of the Aron Brit Hashem, of the Ark of God, and sort of take that responsibility from us? And that's where we leave off today in chapter 6. Any comments or questions before we break? As always, thank you so much for being part of our class on Tuesday night, and I really appreciate it very much. It's I hope it's interesting for you, and it's so meaningful for me. So have a wonderful evening, and as always, I'm keeping my promise to keep classes to an hour. Before the surgery, I used to run an hour and a half, and now you can rely on me to keep it to an hour. Be well. Laila Tov, good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sure, bye-bye.